Founder of the Franciscan order, he was born in Assisi, a town in Umbria, around 1181. In 1182, Pietro Bernardone returned from a trip to France to find that his wife had given birth to a son. However, instead of being pleased, Pietro was furious. His wife had the child baptized as Giovanni, after John the Baptist. Pietro, a wealthy cloth merchant, had different aspirations for his son. He didn't want a pious man. He wanted a businessman, someone who shared his love for France. So he renamed the boy Francesco, meaning Frenchman. Francis grew up in comfort and privilege, thanks to his father's wealth and the indulgence of the era. He was beloved by everyone from an early age, charming, joyful, and a natural leader. His faults were overlooked. His dreams, even if they distracted him from his studies, were indulged. His life seemed charmed, free from any real discipline or correction. As he matured, Francis became the ringleader of a group of young men who indulged in revelry and excess. His biographer, Thomas of Celano, described him as a captivating young man who attracted a following of like-minded companions addicted to vice. Francis himself later admitted, "I lived in sin during this period." Pietro's dreams for his son seemed to be coming true. Francis developed a deep affection for France, its songs, romance, and the wandering troubadours. He even showed promise in business. But Francis longed for something beyond wealth. He yearned for nobility, for the glory of knighthood. His first opportunity came when Assisi went to war with its rival, Perugia. The battle ended disastrously for Assisi, and Francis was captured, spared only because his family could pay a ransom. Even in the grim conditions of the dungeon, Francis maintained his cheerful disposition. After a year, he was ransomed and returned home. Surprisingly, the experience didn't change him. He resumed his life of pleasure with the same enthusiasm as before. Yet, Francis still craved glory. When knights were called for the Fourth Crusade, he eagerly prepared, acquiring an ornate suit of armor and a splendid cloak. But just a day into his journey, a dream directed him to return home. Humiliated, he faced scorn from his peers and anger from his father, who was enraged at the wasted expense. Francis's transformation didn't happen overnight. God had waited patiently for 25 years, and now it was Francis's turn to wait. He began spending more time in prayer, sometimes retreating to a cave to weep for his sins. Though he was overwhelmed with joy by God's grace at times, his life couldn't simply be paused. There was still the family business to attend to. One day, while riding through the countryside, Francis encountered a leper. The sight and smell repulsed him, but he overcame his disgust, dismounted, and kissed the leper's hand. The leper returned the gesture, filling Francis with an inexplicable joy. As he rode away, he turned back to wave, only to find the leper had vanished. Francis believed it was a test from God, one that he had passed. This experience deepened his spiritual quest, leading him to the dilapidated church of San Damiano. While praying there, he heard Christ speak to him from the crucifix, instructing him to repair my church. Interpreting this literally, Francis took cloth from his father's shop, sold it, and used the money to rebuild the church. His father, seeing this as theft and coupled with Francis's recent erratic behavior, dragged him before the bishop. In front of the town, Pietro demanded that Francis return the money and renounce his inheritance. The bishop, showing compassion, told Francis to return the money and assured him that God would provide. Inspired, Francis not only returned the money but stripped off all his clothes, declaring that from that moment on, he would recognize only God as his father. He left the town, clad only in a hair shirt, singing as he walked into the woods. Even when robbers later beat him and took his clothes, Francis climbed out of the ditch, still singing. Francis devoted himself to what he believed was his divine calling. He begged for stones and rebuilt the Church of San Damiano with his own hands, unaware that Christ's call was to restore the church as a whole, not just a single building. The church at the time was suffering from internal corruption and external heresies, appealing to those seeking something different. Soon, Francis began to preach. Though he was never ordained as a priest, he was later reluctantly ordained as a deacon. Francis wasn't a reformer. He preached about returning to God and obeying the church. Despite being aware of the church's failings, he always showed it the utmost respect. When asked about a priest living in sin, Francis knelt before the priest and kissed his hands, recognizing the sacredness of his role. Gradually, companions joined Francis, eager to follow his life of poverty, prayer, and devotion. With these followers, Francis felt the need for some guidance and opened the Bible at random 3 times. He read the passages about selling all possessions, taking nothing for the journey, and bearing the cross daily. "This is our rule," he declared. His approach was radical, living by the gospel in a way that seemed impossible. Francis was so literal that when a thief stole a brother's hood, he made the brother run after the thief to offer his robe as well. Francis never intended to establish a religious order. He disliked the military connotation. He saw his movement as an expression of God's universal brotherhood. His followers came from all walks of life and received equal honor, whether they were beggars or nobles. Francis' sense of brotherhood extended to all of God's creation. His love for nature went beyond admiration. He saw every creature as part of his family. In one famous story, he preached to birds about being grateful to God, and they stood still, only flying away when he gave them permission. In another, Francis tamed a wolf that had been terrorizing a town, turning it into a companion to the townspeople. Following the gospel, Francis and his followers went out to preach, 2 by 2. Initially, people were hostile, fearing the strange madness these men in rags represented. But soon, people noticed their joy and began to welcome them, curious about the happiness they found in owning nothing. Francis didn't seek to eliminate poverty, he sought to sanctify it. His friars gave freely to those in need, and they worked for their necessities, only begging when necessary. Francis forbade them from accepting money, considering it a threat to their spiritual freedom. He believed that possession was the death of love and that true freedom came from having nothing to lose. Francis was a man of action, with a simplicity that extended to both his life and his ideas. When he sought approval for his brotherhood, he went directly to Rome to see Pope Innocent III, who initially dismissed him. But after dreaming that Francis was holding up the Lateran Basilica, the Pope granted him permission to preach. Sometimes, Francis's impulsive nature led to mistakes, which he corrected just as swiftly. Once, he ordered a stuttering brother to preach half-naked. Realizing his error, Francis immediately stopped the brother and preached in his place, also half-naked. Francis's directness was evident when he decided to go to Syria to convert Muslims during the Fifth Crusade. Captured and taken to the Sultan, Francis was not killed but charmed the Sultan with his preaching. The Sultan admitted that he found Christianity beautiful but feared converting because both would be murdered. Francis faced his greatest challenges not from outsiders but from within his own order. As the Brotherhood grew to 5,000 members in just 10 years, external pressures sought to control and moderate its radical poverty. Francis, feeling that his original vision was being compromised, eventually stepped down from leadership. In his final years, Francis experienced great suffering. Praying to share in Christ's passion, he received the stigmata, the marks of Christ's wounds, on his body. His years of poverty and wandering had taken a toll on his health, and he began to go blind. Despite the pain, Francis accepted his suffering with grace. When a hot iron was used to cauterize his eyes, he spoke kindly to the fire, feeling no pain. Francis lived his life with nothing yet had everything. His legacy continues to inspire people around the world.